Very often when you think of a godly person, a man of God or a woman of God, you think of people who are full-time workers, a pastor, a Sunday school superintendent or something like that. But in the Bible, some of the greatest people were people who were doing so-called, what we so-called, secular jobs. And when you ask the question, is it really possible to be a completely devoted Christian while you're doing a normal day-to-day job or being a housewife or something like that? The Bible answers that question with a resounding yes, it's possible. So that's what we are going to follow through for the next 12 weeks. We are going to look at the life of Daniel and his friends and see how they struggled to be faithful to God in an environment where they were a very small minority, and still they did it. So let's turn to the first chapter of Daniel and begin right at the start of this book. The book starts on a very bleak note. It says, in the third year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. So this wicked, powerful king of Babylon has come, and he's trying to besiege Jerusalem. And then verse 2 says, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand and some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar in the house of God, of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. So this looks like a huge defeat for God's people. The king who is supposedly following God has been defeated by this wicked king. Jews are taken to Babylon, and along with that, articles from the temple are taken to the temple of their god. The god's name is Marduk, and it looks like a sheer defeat for the people of God. And yet verse 2 says, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. In other words, it's saying that God is the one who engineered this process. So is God responsible for all the misfortunes that befall the people of God? Well, it's not quite that simple. But the people of God in the Old Testament and the New Testament, there was a strong belief that God was sovereign over the affairs of history. And that's a major theme in the book of Daniel, that God is sovereign over what is happening. And when evil seems to be in control, even through this evil situation, the God who controls history will work out his purposes. Wickedness will show its power, but God will use even the show of power of wickedness to do something ultimately that is good. Here, of course, the people are suffering because they have been disobedient to God. So what is happening here is a punishment on the people for disobedience. But in spite of that, God is working out his purposes. Now, this is the deep foundation which gives us courage to go wherever we go, whether we go into Christian ministry, whether we go into a job of teaching, a job of being a servant in a house, whatever we do. The deep foundation that we have is that God is sovereign, he is king. And so that is a key theme of this book. When God is working out his purposes, finally his purposes will triumph. If that is the case, the wisest thing for us to do is to be obedient to God, to follow him, to follow his ways. And so during the tough times, we have this deep down conviction. We may be bewildered, but there is a deep down conviction God is king. Therefore we cling to his hand and to his principles and to his truth, and seek to be obedient to him. So that's the first principle that I want to talk about. If you are going into the secular world, a lot of things will happen that we don't expect, that we don't like, that seem to be like defeats. But deep down we have this realization that God is working out his purposes in history. So God is sovereign. Now the second thing that we find in this passage is that God can use the natural abilities of an individual as he goes into the world. Verse 3 of chapter 1 of Daniel says that that the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch or his chief official, to bring some people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility. So the king has decided that here are some top people from Israel who have come as exiles. They have been brought in after Israel was defeated. And he says some of them have a lot of ability, so might as well use them. So people from royal families, from the nobility in Israel, the king wants to use to enrich his kingdom. And in verse 4 we are told the qualities that he is looking for: youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. So these are people who have natural abilities, intelligent, good looking, people of good stature physically. So actually many of us don't fit into these categories. These are the king's requirements, not God's requirements. God, of course, can use anybody. And the Bible shows that very clearly. Paul says that not many of you were wise, not many of you were big people whom God chose, but God chose the foolish people to confound the wise. So God can use anybody who's available for him. But here we are talking about the king's requirements. The king wants people who are particularly talented. And God can use talented people to do special things that others can't do. So we should never be jealous of talented people. We should never be jealous of people who have come from family backgrounds that will take them to positions that we may not be able to go to. However, we can use these things because God can use these natural endowments or things that come by virtue of the family to which we were born. God can use them to bring glory to his name. And that is what happened in this particular situation. Well, verse 5 tells us of chapter 1 of Daniel, it tells us that the king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank, when they were to be educated for 3 years. And at the end of the time, they were to stand before the king. They were going to be given the choicest meals, and then they were going to be educated. And then they were to stand before the king. Now in verse 6 of chapter 1, we are introduced to the to the heroes of this book, to the main figures who come in the book of Daniel. And so verse 6 says, among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. Now it's very interesting. Now these are the heroes of the book, but they are not priests, they are not prophets. Those were the full-time Christian workers of those God's workers of those days. They were not those people. These are laymen. And as I said, very often when we think of a great man or woman of God, we think of a full-time worker. But in the Bible, there is a long and distinguished list of heroes who were lay people. They practiced Christianity where they were, and they were great shining examples of what it means to be a saint, to be a person of God. So in Christianity, there is no special order of higher saints and lower saints. Everybody can be a great Christian. So we find Abraham, who is considered the father of the faithful, who was an owner of livestock. Then there is his grandson, Joseph, well actually his great-grandson, Joseph, who was a government official and did great things. Then there was Joshua, who was an army chief, a soldier. Then there was Ruth, another hero in the Bible. She was a housewife. Then there is David, who's called the man after God's own heart. Well, he was first a shepherd, then he became a soldier, and finally he became a king. Then there was Nehemiah, who was a cupbearer for a Persian king, not a king who followed the God of Nehemiah. Then there was Esther, who was the queen of another Persian king. And then there was the great hero of the Bible, Mary, who was a carpenter's wife, but still she's considered such a great person of God. Then in the New Testament we have Dorcas, who was a housewife, and she was presented as one who cared for the poor. As I think of my own life, I'm a full-time worker, but the most influential people in my life were my father and my mother. My mother is the one who taught me the Bible, and she had never gone to a Bible college or anything like that, but we know her as a person of God, and we respected her and we learnt about God from her. My father worked for the government. He worked in the income tax department, and a lot of what we are doing today, the disciplines, the love for books, the love for education, that we got from our father. But he was not a full-time worker, and out of that family came two full-time workers and others who are trying to serve God in other jobs. Now, preachers are important because they study, they give special time to study the word and to explain it. Daniel and his friends were influenced by the words of Jeremiah that Jeremiah sent to the exiles in Babylon. Now, Jeremiah was a full-time worker, a prophet of God. So in chapter 9 and verse 2 of Daniel, we are told how Daniel found help from this letter that Jeremiah had sent to the exiles. Yet, through lay people, the world observes what it means to follow God. They take God's truth to the classroom, to the neighborhood, to the playing field, to the office, to the marketplace. And they show that the gospel really works. Now, this is especially important when Christians are under fire. You know, right through history, there have been all sorts of stories spread about Christians, many of which are not true. But how are people going to know that these things are not true? Well, not by looking at us full-time workers, because they say, oh, that's your job, that's what you're doing for a living. They are going to listen to people with whom they work, with whom they play, with whom they study, with ordinary lay people. They are the ones who are going to show what real Christianity is. So, lay people have a very important task to do. But being a layman in this world is sometimes a little difficult. It's very complex. Now look at verse 4 and the last part of verse 4. They are to be taught the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. So now we are looking at some of the unpleasant aspects of involvement in society. You do certain things that you may not like to do. Now they had to learn the language and the literature of these Babylonians, and these were probably related to magic and to things that they don't really believe in. But they had to study it, even though they don't believe in it, because if they were going to be working for the king, they needed this knowledge. And then verse 7 tells us that they are given different names. And the chief eunuch gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. So they are given new names. Now obviously they wouldn't have been happy about this, because for a Jew a name is just not a tag that identifies a person. It's for the Jew, the name is really what you are, all the names of the Jews had meanings, and they are supposed to depict the character, the soul of a person. Instead of these names that had very rich meaning, now they are given Babylonian names, probably the names that related to the Babylonian gods. Obviously, they wouldn't have liked to do that. But you know, when you go into the world, there are some things that you need to do which you don't like to do, but which are not a compromise of your principles. Later we will see how these people refuse to compromise their principles. But when you are doing, when you go, there will be some things you don't like, but which you have to do because you are part of that, in order to identify, in order to be part of the job, the community that you are a part of. You see, Christians are people with two addresses. One address is in heaven, the other address is down here. And we belong to both worlds. And in both worlds, we have to thrive. And sometimes to thrive in the earthly world, you do things that you may not like to do. Let me give you some examples. Like you may want to go to a party, you may have to go to a party or to a reception, which you find very boring. Perhaps everybody is drinking at that party, and you're a teetotaler, you don't drink. And you have to go and be with them, and it's quite embarrassing because people will try to force you to take some whiskey or something like that, and you have to be polite and refuse them. It's quite embarrassing, and yet that is part of being involved. When you're in school, when you're in your workplace, people are going to tell a lot of off-color jokes. They are going to say things that you think are very unclean, but you're seated at your desk. You can't leave the desk every time an off-color joke is said. So it's unpleasant to you, but you do it. Sometimes you have to do proficiency tests in things that you don't like. Maybe it's a language you don't like, but you're supposed to have proficiency in that language. And in order to thrive in your job, you will have to do those proficiency tests. Sometimes you're very busy, and there is some function of the children in the school, and you think, oh, that's the last thing I want to be going for. But because your children are part of this school and because you are part of this community, you go for that. So we get involved in neighborhood gatherings, for example, parties that sometimes again you may think is a waste of time, but it's a time that you get involved because we are committed to our communities, we are committed to our neighborhoods. We want to be involved in our neighborhoods as responsible citizens. So there are unpleasant aspects of involvement. So far we have looked at a few principles. Firstly, we have said that God is sovereign. Then we have said that God uses natural abilities. Then we have said that laymen have a very special place to play in God's program. But however, we have said that sometimes you have to do unpleasant things as you do that. Now, we look at the next principle, our fifth principle, which is obedient involvement in society. When you get involved in society, you have to be obedient to your boss and you have to be obedient to God. You have to study the subjects that you do, but you have to do it as a follower of God. And that means sometimes we have to stay away from doing things that go against our principles. So let's look at verse 8. Verse 8 of chapter 1 of Daniel says, "But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself." So Daniel decides not to eat the food that he is given. Now verses 11 to 14 tell us that Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, also joined Daniel in not participating in this food. So why is it that they didn't take this food? Well, we are not really given the reason, and there is nothing conclusive as far as an explanation, but obviously these people considered this food unclean, and it was their way of avoiding assimilation. They had to maintain their identity as Jews, as followers of God, and in some way eating this food signal the fact that they were not doing that. So they stayed away from eating this food. Now, this is what we might call obedient involvement while being involved in society. Obedience to God and involvement with God. Now, as you look at the world, you come up with three approaches that Christians can have towards the world, towards involvement in the world. The first approach is what we might call accommodation. In other words, what to do? We are living in a world that is evil, so you have to do the evil things if you are going to survive in this world. That's what we call accommodation. So you're a Christian on Sunday, and then the rest of the week you forget about your Christianity. But this is so for example, if everybody is dishonest, you are dishonest. If everybody puts the wrong time in the register that you come in for work and clock out, well, if everybody puts the wrong time, you also do that. Everybody takes bribes, so you also take the bribe. And things like that. Now there, we are saying what to do. We can't be fully Christian, so we will accommodate ourselves. Well, Daniel and his friends are a challenge to this, as we will see over the next few weeks. They will show that it is possible to be involved and pay the price of that. The second, so that's the first approach, accommodation. The second approach is what we might call isolation. Now, in the approach of isolation, what people say is, this is a bad world. And if you're going to be a saint in this bad world, you'll have to leave the world. You can't get involved in the world. And there are some people whom we consider godly who are like that. They really don't know what is happening in the world because they keep the world at a safe distance. But that's not the Christian approach, because the Christian believes that this world was created by God. And if God asks us, if God created this world, then we have to go into this world which God created and thrive and be and contribute to this world. Jesus, when he sent his disciples into the world, he says, they are not of this world, but I am sending them into the world. So we are not of the world in the sense that we don't accommodate ourselves to the evil of this world, but we go into the world because we believe that this is God's world. So that's what Jesus told his disciples. That's found in John 17 and verses 15 and 18. In another place, Jesus said, we are the salt of the world. Now, you can't be salt unless you go in and influence that. In another place, he called us leaven in the world, a leaven which leavens the whole lump. And you can't be leaven if you're outside. You have to get in. There was a great Christian politician in England called William Wilberforce. He became an MP, member of Parliament, when he was about 21 years old. And then as he began to, read some books while on a holiday during his vacation, he read a book, and this book spoke to him. And he didn't believe in a God. He thought, well, if there's a God, I don't need him. But this book began to make him question whether there was a God who was involved in this world, and he needs to be involved with this God. Well, little by little, he became convinced that he wants to follow Christ. But he loved politics. So he had a question, now am I going to be a Christian, or a full Christian, or am I going to be a politician? So he went and met a pastor. This pastor's name was John Newton, who later became his great friend and co-laborer in his approach to overcoming slavery in the world, in the British Empire. He went and met his friend, and he told him his dilemma. He said, I want to be a Christian, but I also like politics. And what am I to choose? And John Newton told him, you do both. You be a Christian politician. And he went and he was used to do a lot of good, to fight against slavery as a Christian and as a politician. This is obedient involvement in society. We had a Sri Lankan cricketer who was a Christian who once came to one of our youth programs, and there was a question and answer time where the young people were allowed to ask him questions. And they asked him, how did you survive as a Christian, as you travel all these places and all sorts of terrible things happen? How do you survive to maintain your Christian testimony in the midst of all of that? And this cricketer said, I do everything for God. When I go to bat, I go to bat for God. When I keep wickets, I keep wickets for God. When I'm in my hotel room, I am in my hotel room for God. And he even said, when I go to the bathroom, I go to the bathroom for God. He was involved in cricket, but he was also doing everything for God. And that's my hope, that we will have more and more people who will go into the world and be obediently involved. So let me tell you 5 principles that we looked at today. God is sovereign, whatever happens. Therefore, we have the courage to be obedient to him as we go into the world. Secondly, God can use our natural abilities. So we can look at these natural abilities and look forward to God using them. Thirdly, lay people have a unique role in God's plan. Lay people can be great Christians. Fourthly, obedience may involvement in the world may include certain unpleasant aspects, things that we don't like to do, which we have to do because we go into society. And fifthly, we don't accommodate ourselves to the evil of this world. We don't isolate ourselves from the world. We are obedient to God and we are involved. Obedient involvement is our approach to this world. I hope that many such people will be raised up in wherever we are to obediently live for God in this world. Thank you.